How's it going, guys? Today we are going to go over how to implement my random dungeon generation system. I've never been a big fan of the methods that used arrays and grids. There's just a lot of math and a lot of double and triple checking, lots of variables to keep track of, and it was all just real big hassle, I thought. So I've developed this method that is a lot simpler and still makes great looking dungeons. So with that, let's see what we're working with. We've got a handful of sprites here. We've got a wall, floor, chest, door. They're all 32 by 32 with the origin at 0, 0. That's important for later. The player is 16 by 16 with his origin in the middle. That's kind of irrelevant. You make your object player whatever you want it to be. Okay, we've got one script that we'll talk about later. And we've got a handful of objects here. First one we're going to talk about is the controller object. Okay, that's the object that controls everything in the room, obviously. So it's got a create event, and in that create event we set up a couple variables. We set one that lets us know when the dungeon is finished generating. We set our grid size, and then we set up a couple variables that spawns the dungeon carver at a precise spot in the middle of the room that's divisible by 32. That's important because of the way the dungeon generation works. If it's not exactly divisible by 32, things get off center and it looks ugly. So that's the things that run through the create event and the controller. And the step event, all the instances outside of the current view are deactivated. This is an important process to do because in rooms as large as the one we're working with, having many instances active at the same time can cause a lot of slowdown, and that is not something we want to deal with. And the draw GUI is just a simple FPS, so we can see how well the game's running. Okay, and now we'll get to the real bread and butter here, which is the OBJ dungeon carver. This is the object that does pretty much all of the work for creating your dungeon. So in the create event is where we set up all of our variables. They're all commented out. We can see the life determines how long it should be around. The direction change determines when the carver should try to change directions. The speed determines how fast the carver moves. We want this to be the same as our grid width because the carver places a floor tile every single step. Okay, and here we have our chance to spawn a room, and if it does, how wide and how tall that room should be. Here we set up our floor and door objects, and then our chances to spawn another dungeon carver. Okay, and then we set up these half width and half height variables to constrain the movement of the dungeon carver. We don't want it getting too close to the edge of the room, because if it does, it kind of ruins the immersion if there's a hallway just running off into the middle of nowhere. Okay, so this one, we want to make sure we have got an open room where the player is going to spawn. So what we do is we take, I want mine to be 6 blocks wide by 6 blocks tall. So we start at -3 and move to +3, up and down, and left to right. So, and then in each of those spots, we'll create a floor object. Okay, and this happens only when the dungeon is created. So now all that's done, the dungeon carver picks a direction, starts moving in that direction at the speed we specified, sets its alarm 0 to its life, and then sets its alarm 1 to how long we want it to be until it changes. Okay, so now we'll go into the step event and see what happens. So as you can see, every step the dungeon carver is going to create a floor tile. Okay, so That's pretty self-explanatory. That's what's going to be your hallways throughout your dungeon. And now we've got our spawn mod and spawn chance variables. What the first one does is just counts how many objects there are of the dungeon carver. And then spawn chance, we have a random variable of 500 times the spawn mod plus 1. What that does is, if there's a lot of dungeon carvers on the screen, we don't want to spawn a whole lot more. So the more dungeon carvers there are, the less likely it will be to spawn a new one. So if this happens to land on 0 while it's picking a bunch of random numbers every step, we'll create a new dungeon carver. Okay, so now we'll get into generating rooms. So this works the same way as the spawn chance. Every step we're picking a number between 0 and 25. If it happens to come up 0, we're going to create a room. That room, we choose a width. You can make this whatever you want. I just do 1, 2, 3. It makes good sized rooms, very, nice and varied. You do the same thing for height. And we loop through these from all the way left to right, and then top to bottom. And then for each of the blocks that were chosen to be a room, we create a floor. And down here, this is where we constrain the carver's movement with the half width and half height variables we set up before. We just use min and max. What min does is it will place the x value at the minimum of the x current, or what is room width minus the half width variable. So it can't get closer than 320 pixels to the edge of the screen. And the same with the other way, it can't get more than 320 pixels to the left. And then the same idea with the Y, limiting movement through top and bottom. Okay, so now we'll go to alarm 1. This is the one that will make the carver change directions. It's very simple. The carver can choose a new direction, then it starts moving in that direction. Then we choose a new timer for the alarm and set the alarm to that time. That's very straightforward. Okay, at alarm 0, remember, we set this to be the life of the carver object. So once this reaches 0, the carver destroys itself. Okay, and now the last event is on destroy. Okay, so when the carver destroys itself, if it's the last one, that's what we're checking. If instant number equals 1, we want to create a door at its position, and we also want to build the walls of our dungeon. This is the Scr Dungeon Walls we saw earlier, so we'll go over that now. So we'll open up Scr Dungeon Walls, and we'll see with argument 0, and you can see we used FLR, which was a variable we determined was our floor object of obj floor. So with all the floor objects, and then we look at argument 1, which is going to be our speed, which we set as 32. So all the floor objects are going to look all in a radius around them of 32 pixels. Okay, so that's what this is doing. This is handling the left to right movement, and this is handling the top to bottom movement, checking all of them. And then if the places are empty when it checks them, it will create a wall. Okay, and then once all the walls are created, we create our player object right in the middle of the room. Okay, so it's pretty explanatory, and again, it's all commented out, so you can read it up, more in depth when you download it. Okay, and the last one we really want to go over is object floor. So we've got our dungeon carver making these floor objects, and when they're created, each floor object has a chance to spawn enemies and chests. So we've got our chest object is defined as the variable chest, and then the same thing with our enemy. Okay, so we've got our chest, spawn, the chance to spawn a chest, and then we've got the chance to spawn an enemy is set up as a random variable also. So we go down here and we say if distance to point middle of the room is greater than 320. So we don't want enemies and chests spawned right on top of the player. You don't want to do that to your player. It never ends well. So if this isn't true, we don't even bother with this. But if it is, we go through and see if the chest spawn equals 0, we'll spawn a chest, and the same with enemy spawn. Same with our objects, before, the way we work with spawning dungeon carvers and the way we work with carving out new rooms. It's the same principle. So that's how your enemies and treasure chests will get generated. Okay, so that's really all the objects that do anything. We've just got a simple player object. What it does is when it's created is it switches the view from the big wide view where we can see the entire dungeon down to view 1, which is our view that's zoomed in on the player and follows them around. And then it sets the room speed down to 30. What it is the room speed initially starts out at 3600. Since we're not able to do anything, we set the room speed real high so that the dungeon carver objects really zip around the room and get things done as quickly as possible. There's no need to set it down to 30. It'll just take forever if you do that. So that's why we do that. And this step event is just a simple movement code. There's no collision in it. You can move through walls with this player. This was intended just to let you look around the dungeon and see how things look. So that, and then if you press the R key, it'll restart the room. You'll get a whole new dungeon to look around and explore. Okay, so just remember, all these objects are really placeholders, just meant to give you an idea of how the dungeon generator works. If you use these in your own game, you'll want to replace these with your own objects. Okay, so I hope you guys found this informative. There'll be download links for a demo to play around with, as well as the project file in the description below. If you like this tutorial, feel free to comment, like, subscribe. I'd like to hear what you guys think. So I will see you guys next time.